Coming soon, The Assassination, an investigation into a true story that shook the world. A new podcast from the BBC World Service. Subscribe to The Assassination now, and you'll get every episode automatically.
This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news, compiled in the early hours of Thursday, the 21st of December. I'm Nick Miles with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, a close ally of the British Prime Minister Theresa May has been forced to resign from the government. Ugandan MPs vote to remove an age limit for presidential candidates. President Museveni can now run for a sixth term in office. Donald Trump celebrates Congress passing his tax bill.
We have companies pouring back into our country, and that means jobs, and it means really the formation of new, young, beautiful, strong companies. So that's going to be very, very important.
We ask what it means for ordinary Americans and the wider business world. And later. Taking a gamble, Lady Gaga is following in the footsteps of her musical heroes and moving to Las Vegas for a 2-year residency. But we begin here in Britain, where a senior government minister, Damien Green, has been sacked. He was being investigated in connection with claims that he'd behaved inappropriately towards a political activist and that legal pornography had been found on computers in his office 9 years ago. I got more details from our political correspondent, Rob Watson.
He's being sacked because of the investigation finding that he had made what they called inaccurate and misleading statements about what he knew about those claims that you mentioned, that pornography was found on a computer in his office in 2008. He'd sort of implied that he didn't know anything about it, whereas he had, in fact, his lawyers had been informed about it. But I guess the reason why it's a little bit odd is that the original focus of the investigation, which of course had come about in part a result of the Harvey Weinstein affair and people coming out and making allegations about politicians, the idea that he had made unwanted advances to a female journalist. The inquiry found that on that, although her account was plausible, they couldn't be absolutely sure. So that's why, in a funny sort of way, he's resigned over a technicality, over an earlier investigation.
Yeah, and yet, as you said, it demonstrates a wider pattern at play here, the impact of allegations of impropriety of any kind on public figures, even when those allegations are strongly denied, can be extremely serious.
Absolutely, and there are guidelines set down for ministers, and whether you think that these issues are of the first order or not, it doesn't matter. If you're found to have made a misleading statement, I think it's considered that you just cannot stay in your job. And I think with great reluctance, and after much contemplation and much worrying and thinking it over, Theresa May had to sack him.
So how much of a blow is this for Prime Minister Theresa May?
It is a big blow for her because he is a close friend and ally, and Theresa May is rather unusual, I guess, for British politicians in the sense that she doesn't have very many close friends in politics, but Damien Green is someone that she has known going back to the 1970s. They were at university together, so he is one of her few genuine friends and allies. I think there is a huge but here, though, and that is you've got to put this in some kind of context. I mean, given the overall challenges facing Theresa May over the divisions in the governing Conservative Party, over the future of Brexit, how those negotiations should be carried out, the concerns of business, while losing Mr Green as a loss, I think it's hardly a threat to the stability of the government.
That was Rob Watson, our political correspondent. Yoweri Museveni has been president of Uganda since 1986. He's one of Africa's longest-serving leaders. Now it seems he could continue in office even longer after the Ugandan parliament approved a change to the constitution, which removes the current age limit for presidential candidates. Catherine Byaruhanga is following developments from the capital, Kampala.
More than two-thirds of MPs voted to change the constitution. The new legislation means President Yoweri Museveni, who would have been above the 75-year age limit, can now run for a sixth term in office. Several MPs praised his 30-year rule, saying he has transformed the economy and brought peace to a country once ravaged by civil war. A 2-term limit for the presidency was reintroduced. The provision was initially repealed in 2005, but commentators say it could be removed again. Legislators also voted to extend their term in office from 5 to 7 years. It's seen as a sweetener for them to back this legislation and possibly offer a buffer from an electorate that could be angry about this decision. There have been widespread protests about the removal of the age cap, and opinion polls suggest most Ugandans are opposed to the move. The government disagrees with the polls and says it's just a few people protesting.
Catherine Byaruhanga in Kampala. The United States Congress has given its final seal of approval to a package of Republican reforms which would lead to tax cuts, mainly for companies and higher earners. 11 months into office, it finally gives President Trump his first big legislative victory.
The heart of our bill is a tremendous amount of relief for the middle class, including a doubling of the child tax credit and a nearly doubling of the standard deduction. That's going to be tremendous for people. They're going to start seeing the results in February. This bill means more take-home pay. It will be an incredible Christmas gift for hardworking Americans. I said I wanted to have it done before Christmas. We got it done.
Under the changes, the main US company tax rate would fall sharply from 35% now to 21%, and the highest rate of personal tax would also drop from about 40% to 37%. These Republicans in the state of Missouri are celebrating the news.
I think it's hopefully going to be good for most of the people in the United States. I think simplifying things will be particularly good. I know some people say that this is only going to be good for the rich, but I think it will help people across the board and a lot of the middle class, which I consider myself part of the middle class.
What I would really like to see is not only a tax cut, but the government being forced to tighten their belt to say, we're going to give people back some of their money, and the government itself is going to run on less.
But opponents warn that the gap between rich and poor will widen under the reforms while increasing the national debt. Democrat Nancy Pelosi criticised Republican enthusiasm for the changes.
Shamefully, the Republicans were cheering against the children as they robbed from their future and ransacked the middle class to reward the rich. And so today, the Republicans take their victory lap for successfully pillaging the American middle class to benefit the powerful and the privileged.
But what about the global impact on the rest of the business world? Eric Toder, co-director of the Washington think tank, the Tax Policy Center, gave Mike Johnson his assessment.
There's been a sort of race for the bottom on corporate tax rates for many years. The U.S. rate was set at 34% in the Tax Reform Act of 86 and increased to 35 in 93. At that time, we were among the lowest in the world, and now we've moved to the absolute highest because everyone else is reducing their rates. So this race has been going on for a long time. The U.S. has not been playing.
Do you think it is an effort to try to attract more companies to base in the U.S., or is something else going on?
The primary effect of lowering the rate makes it more attractive to invest in the U.S., whether a U.S.-based company or a foreign-based company. They're also trying to help U.S.-based companies by moving toward a territorial tax system. And
what does that mean exactly?
It means that the U.S. is now the only country in the G7 which will tax the dividends that U.S. companies receive from their foreign affiliates. We will no longer do that. Britain and Japan stopped doing that around 2009, 2010. So we're the only ones that do that. Now we're trying to counter that because one of the effects of doing that is it would cause even more profit shifting by U.S. companies to low-tax countries and to tax havens. So we're also putting in a minimum tax, which works in the opposite direction.
Of course, we've got to point out that even though the US corporate tax rate would fall to 21%, that's still higher than some countries, like Ireland, for example, 12.5%, one of its company tax rates in Ireland.
You have to realize Ireland's a small country, and if more capital moves in, it drives down the pre-tax return, so you pay less tax, but you're not necessarily getting more after-tax profits. So I don't think there's so much concern about a lot of real investment moving to Ireland. There is a lot of concern about people locating their IP there, so they're reporting income there, not so much investing.
So that's intellectual property.
Yeah, intellectual property. And then through various means shifting it from Ireland to places like Bermuda and the Caymans where there's no income tax. So that's what the minimum tax is supposed to counteract.
So do you think there will be a sea of investment, a new wave of investment, if you like, coming to the US once this tax package becomes law?
I think it will create more incentives to invest in the US, so there probably would be some shift. And also the fact that we're allowing expensing immediate write-off of equipment for the first 5 years of this bill, which will attract some investment.
The US tax expert Eric Toder. The civil rights movement in the United States may have had its heyday more than 50 years ago, but it still has a hold on the American imagination. Indeed, a new play that's just opened in Washington, D.C. looks at one woman whose music was a soundtrack to the era. She was Nina Simone. Our reporter Jane O'Brien has been to see the play.
The civil rights anthem Mississippi Goddamn was Nina Simone's groundbreaking response to racial injustice and the murder of 4 little girls in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, Alabama in 1963. Harriet D. Foy takes the title role in the play Nina Simone 4 Women, now getting its East Coast debut at Washington's Arena Stage.
Somebody's got to say the unspeakable when something awful happens.
That somebody you?
I've been blessed to be so cursed. Oh, Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Cinnamon, where you gonna run?
So special is to be able to give voice to Miss Simone, who's no longer with us. Also to be on stage in a piece where we get to have a sense of pride as women of color, black women. It's empowering.
Once seen more as a relic of the civil rights era, Nina Simone, who died in 2003, has re-emerged in the last few years as an eternal voice against bigotry and injustice. The play imagines a conversation between her and 3 other African-American women in the bombed-out ruins of the Alabama church and is a contemporary call for activism.
Where is the sitting taking place? At the piano. You can't be serious. Don't underestimate a piano. It weighs 600 pounds, has 88 keys and infinite possibilities. So I run to the sea, it was falling, I run to the sea, it was
We have this open platform, as Miss Simone says in one of the scenes. Here we can say whatever we feel. What's radical is that we can now say this. We have this platform, so we're inviting you in to this 90-minute session of us healing ourselves, of us releasing all these things that have held us back, because now we're going to move forward.
Nina Simone took no prisoners in her lifetime, telling Martin Luther King that she was definitely not non-violent. But at her core, she wanted to use her music to create a better world.
That piano sure sounds good.
It better if it's going to help me kick Jim Crow's hide.
How you gonna do what no man, woman, or child been able to do?
When words falter, music doesn't. Oh, Jim Crow, where you been, babe? Down Mississippi and back again. Oh, Jim Crow, don't you know?
Once we call 5 minutes, then I'm in. So I can't speak or anything. And I'm standing backstage listening to the audience as if I was her. And I commune with her. And I say, Miss Simone, how are we going to do this tonight? And she lets me know. And that's how we go.
It's all over now. Oh, Jim Crow, you've been around too long. Gotta work the devil till dead and gone.
That report from Washington by Jane O'Brien. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. Still to come.
There's a huge mix of cultures and people living here, and we've got some big businesses as well. But I think people who live here want it to be on more of a sort of global stage.
We hear from the city that will host the 2022 Commonwealth Games. But first, here's Owen Bennett-Jones to tell you more about the forthcoming BBC World Service podcast, The Assassination.
Our brand new podcast series, The Assassination, is about an unsolved murder with global ramifications. It's an investigation into the assassination of one of the world's most prominent politicians, Pakistan's Benazir Bhutto. Subscribe now and you won't miss episode 1. Search for The Assassination where you get your podcasts.
Among the long-running conflicts we cover around the world, Ukraine appears less frequently. That, despite the fact that more than 10,000 people have died in the east of the country in the last 3.5 years in a conflict between the Ukrainian authorities and pro-Russian separatists. And now international monitors say the situation is sharply worsening. The violence is at its worst level for almost a year. In a moment, we'll hear from the US ambassador to Ukraine. First, let's get the perspective from Russia. Olga Ivshina is from the BBC Russian service. Tim Franks asked her why Moscow has withdrawn its military officers from a joint Russian-Ukrainian monitoring mission in eastern Ukraine.
It's very hard to verify their claims, but the Russians claim that the circumstances in which they operated were unbearable, that they didn't have any freedom of movement, and basically they couldn't operate in this environment anymore. That's their claims. The Ukrainian side denies that the circumstances were unbearable, but the outcome is that today Russian monitors are back to Russia.
How far is there a sense from what you're hearing and seeing and reading in Russia that there may be a move to increase the level of military activity in eastern Ukraine?
It seems to happen from time to time. To be clear, this ceasefire agreement, these Minsk agreements, they were never properly fulfilled. There was always some shooting and shelling at the front line. Almost every day someone was killed, either service personnel or the civilians. And indeed, from time to time, some escalations do happen. But this one, the latest one in the last 48 hours, seems to be quite serious. We see multiple grenade launches, multiple rockets being fired at the civilian targets. It is very serious, especially bearing in mind that it's winter, it's sub-zero temperatures, and it's very hard for civilians to cope.
And fired from which side? From both sides, you say?
The heavy artillery, multiple rocket launches are being fired from the territory controlled by the separatists, but in reverse, separatists claim that some areas in Donetsk region and in Lugansk region were fired as well, including areas near schools and residential areas.
Russia insists that these separatists in eastern Ukraine are acting on their own. They don't have material support from Russia. But how far is their cause still a popular one inside Russia?
Generally, I think there are mixed feelings because people understand that conflict in eastern Ukraine does take a lot from Russia. It invests a lot of money, a lot of resources there, and Russian economy is struggling at the moment. And of course, I heard many times when ordinary Russians, especially those who are struggling to survive, who live at the brink of being completely poor, they say, why are we sending all those humanitarian convoys and all that money to eastern Ukraine, even though our people are hungry and are struggling?
Kurt Volker is the US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. How concerned is he by the apparent upsurge in violence?
This conflict has been going on for 3.5 years, and in contrast to people thinking that, well, maybe it's parked and nothing's happening, it's actually been one of the worst years of violence since 2014 and this year in 2017. And the past week has been one of the worst weeks since the very heavy battle of Avdiivka in January and February earlier this year.
And in terms of the withdrawal of these Russian monitoring officers, do you fear that that presages again an uptick in the violence?
It clearly preceded this recent uptick in the violence, so there is that. I think it comes back to what degree is Russia responsible for the violence there, and to what degree are these separatist groups independent. And the reality is they didn't exist before 2014. They were created by the intervention of Russia through this, remember what we all talked about was the little green men. They created this uprising. There was no ethnic conflict or violence prior to that. They're supplied by Russia. Their heavy equipment has come from Russia. So it is a Russian-constructed and Russian-commanded and controlled uprising. Now with that, the Russians have been on the ground in the JCCC, which is that coordinating mechanism, which has been useful for local efforts to help a ceasefire take hold, for instance. They're pulling out in order to try to force Ukraine to deal with those proxy separatist groups, as if they have a legitimacy and an ability to act on their own. Russia's trying to remove itself from that equation. It's simply not credible to do that, and I think Russia is abdicating an important responsibility.
Given your argument, and given also, of course, that Russia flatly denies that account of events and its involvement in eastern Ukraine, I just wonder how much you feel you've got to talk about with the Russians. I mean, you do have contact with this Kremlin aide, Vladislav Surkov, to talk about trying to find a way to broker some sort of peace inside Ukraine, because we've got this flimsy ceasefire agreement. I mean, if you can't even agree on the basic facts of the conflict, how much chance is there that you can achieve a breakthrough?
Just because the Russians say that they're not involved doesn't mean they don't know what they're actually doing. And so I think there is a reality to the discussion underneath the rhetoric that is being deployed. The Russians wanted to produce a Ukraine that was back in its orbit, something that was a Russia-friendly Ukraine, a compliant government in Ukraine. But by invading and occupying and then annexing Crimea, they have produced the opposite. They have created a more unified, nationalist, Western-oriented Ukraine. And that's the reason they might find it in their own interest to stop.
Britain's most valuable company, Royal Dutch Shell, and the Italian oil conglomerate Eni have been ordered to stand trial in Italy in what has been described as one of the biggest corporate corruption cases in history. Both firms and several senior officials face allegations in connection with a deal in Nigeria. All deny any wrongdoing. The trial in Italy is expected to start in March next year. Here's our business editor, Simon Jack.
The charges relate to the purchase of a Nigerian oil field in 2011 for nearly £1 billion. It's alleged that Shell, along with the Italian oil giant Eni and senior executives from both companies, paid the money into a Nigerian government account, knowing it would go to a company controlled by former oil minister and convicted money launderer Daniel Etete. Shell has previously denied it knew the money would end up in Etete's pocket. But employee emails uncovered by the anti-corruption charity Global Witness and reported by the BBC in April appeared to show that Malcolm Brinded, Shell's head of exploration and the second most senior executive at the company, had been advised the money would go to Etete and was likely to be used to pay political bribes. In April, Shell conceded that it did know the money would go to Etete, but did not concede it knew the money might be used for political payoffs and denied any wrongdoing. Also facing trial is Shell's partner in the deal, Eni, and its current chief executive, Claudia Descalzi. Penalties could include up to 10 years in jail for the individuals and heavy fines for the companies, as well as potential exclusion from bidding for international contracts. Spokespeople for Shell, Eni and the individuals charged said they believe the trial judges would conclude there was no case against the firms or their former employees.
Simon Jack. Later today, the host of the 2022 Commonwealth Games will be announced. Spoiler alert, it's going to be the English city of Birmingham. 52 nations, mostly former territories of the British Empire, compete in the Games. Durban in South Africa was to have hosted the competition, but it pulled out because of financial problems. And Birmingham was the only other place put forward to replace it. The event will cost around $1.1 billion. So why does the city want it? The BBC's Leona Smart is based there.
Birmingham is the UK's second city in terms of population, and people who live here want it to become better known. It's got lots and lots going on. There's a huge mix of cultures and people living here, and we've got some big businesses as well. But I think people who live here want it to be on more of a sort of global stage.
Next year's Commonwealth Games are in Queensland. Much more enticing, perhaps, as a tourist destination. Is there a lot of optimism in Birmingham that you can compete alongside the likes of Queensland?
I suppose we won't be able to compete with them in terms of the weather, maybe, as much as we might hope for that 2 weeks in August in 2022 to be as warm as Queensland. But people in Birmingham will be hoping that we can offer is something that is a sort of genuine look at kind of grassroots sports in the UK. I mean, at the moment, our biggest athletic stadium is the Alexander Stadium. which is just outside of the city centre and has hosted the World Athletics Championships in the past. You know, it's got a real sort of homegrown sense of athletes that then start there and go on to do bigger and better things on a world stage.
There is a bit of a risk here, though, isn't there? Because playing host to a major sporting event is often regarded as a guaranteed way of losing money. How are the organisers there saying that they're going to avoid that?
It's absolutely right that it is expensive, and that is something that has worried the people of Birmingham and the West Midlands, which of course is the sort of area in the UK that Birmingham sits within. Now, it's going to cost £800 million, which of course is a huge amount of money to put on an event like this, especially when you think it's only going to last for 2 weeks. £600 million of that is going to be put up by the UK government, but £200 million has to come from Birmingham City Council. So obviously that's a big worry, and the big thing that people have been saying to us here locally is that they want to see something afterwards. Yes, they want a great event, they want it to have a brilliant, games, but after that they want to see some legacy. And the thing that the City Council are trying to sort of soothe them in a way, I suppose, is to put a big promise in for new homes, for one, 4,000 of them around the stadium they're going to build, and new, bigger, better sporting events. They're going to expand the athletic stadium that's currently here so that it can sit up to 40,000 people. And they're going to build a new aquatic centre as well, all with the promise of being able to offer schools, young people, communities in and around Birmingham who perhaps don't have access to that kind of sporting facilities at the moment, the chance to get involved in that, to have pride in their city, pride in their country, and who knows, perhaps become the next Commonwealth contestants for the next Games.
That was Leona Smart in Birmingham. Finally, for many of America's singing greats, a residency in Las Vegas has been somewhat of a rite of passage. Now, following in the footsteps of Elvis Presley, Frank Sinatra and many others, comes Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga with some of her biggest hits, Born This Way, Bad Romance and the aptly named Poker Face. The US singer, who's 31, is to perform 74 concerts over a 2-year period starting late next year, reportedly earning more than $1 million per show. But why now? Mark Savage is our music reporter.
Lady Gaga has always been fascinated by the Rat Pack era of Las Vegas. She did an album of duets with Tony Bennett. She's always idolised Frank Sinatra and the singers that her father listened to when she was growing up. So for her, this is kind of stepping into that tradition. And when she announced these dates, it was those artists that she referenced, not Jennifer Lopez and Britney Spears, who are more her contemporaries and also have Las Vegas residencies. She wants to be part of that heritage.
And what have her fans been saying about this? Has there been some negativity saying perhaps she shouldn't be doing this at this stage?
Her fans in America are delighted because it kind of means she's based there for the next 2 years. Over in Europe and the rest of the world, I think there's a bit more of a concern that she's going to be out of action or she's going to concentrate on that side of her career. But having said that, people who follow her very closely and have seen the documentary she put out this year are very aware that Lady Gaga has a long-term chronic illness called fibromyalgia, which causes a lot of muscle pain and joint pain. It led her to postpone dozens of dates in Europe earlier this year, which have now been rescheduled for 2018. And I think in terms of managing that condition, staying in one place, having a residency in Vegas makes an awful lot of sense. But there's no doubt that she's not the force she was 5 years ago. She's not been nominated for a lot of Grammys for her recent album, Joanne. She's not on the front page of the paper every day in a ridiculous costume. But having said that, she's agreed initially to do 74 dates over 2 years. I know she's at work on her 6th album. So I think what she will probably do is balance the dates in Vegas with promotional tours and concert dates elsewhere in the world, which is what Elton John did when he was in Vegas and what a lot of other artists do.
And for those people who don't follow Lady Gaga's career very closely, remind us why she's such a big thing.
She came out at a point when the music industry was on its knees, when there was no money, when piracy was bringing the whole industry down to the ground, and had all of the glamour of Madonna in the 80s. She spent vast amounts of money on costumes. She made records that sold in huge quantities around the world. And she was kind of like a shot in the arm. You know, music can still be exciting at a point where it had all been kind of indie bands and very grey.
That was Mark Savage. And that's all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Nick Miles. Until next time, goodbye, and we'll leave you with Lady Gaga and Poker.